In 1881, a British surveyor named Flinders Petrie set up a theodolite on the Giza Plateau and began measuring the single largest stone structure most people will ever stand next to, a monument already more than 4,000 years old by the time he arrived. What his instruments recorded should have settled the matter for good. Instead, it opened a mystery that has never fully closed. The four sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned to true north, south, east, and west, with an average error of roughly 3 to 4 arc minutes, a deviation smaller than the width of a fingernail held at arm's length, achieved without a compass, without modern surveying equipment, across a base covering more than 5 hectares of desert. That number alone should be impressive enough. It isn't even the strangest part. The pyramid's base is level to within a few centimeters across its entire footprint. Its core blocks, some weighing more than 2 tons, were quarried, transported, and stacked into a structure that has stood for roughly 4,500 years, surviving earthquakes, looting, and the slow erosion of an entire civilization, while remaining the most precisely oriented large structure built anywhere on Earth until the modern era. Petrie himself, examining the descending entrance passage with the same meticulous instruments, recorded its slope angle to within a fraction of a single arc minute of consistency across its entire length. A tunnel bored carefully through solid rock and stacked masonry, holding a perfectly uniform angle for well over 100 meters, with nothing resembling a modern laser level available to check the work as it progressed. So here is the real question this episode is built around. Not how was it built, although we will look at that too, but why does a single tomb, built for one king, 4,500 years ago, keep generating new questions instead of running out of them? Some of what follows is rigorously documented archaeology and mathematics. Some is genuine, ongoing academic debate about the pyramid's deeper purpose. And some is speculation that mainstream Egyptologists explicitly reject, often for very good reasons. We'll mark the difference clearly, every step of the way. Let's start with the structure itself, because the basic facts are already stranger than most documentaries bother to mention. The Great Pyramid was built during the reign of the pharaoh Khufu in approximately 2560 BCE as the centerpiece of a vast funerary complex on the Giza Plateau outside modern Cairo. According to the most widely accepted mainstream account, it was constructed over roughly 2 decades by a workforce of skilled laborers, not slaves, organized into rotating crews, housed in a purpose-built town whose remains archaeologists have since excavated nearby, complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities for treating workplace injuries. That single detail already runs directly against a popular myth most people grew up believing without ever questioning it. This was not a project built on the backs of chained captives. It was, according to the archaeological record, a massive state-organized labor operation, complete with worker housing, rationed bread and beer, and what appears to be deliberate care for the people doing the lifting. Skeletal remains recovered from the workers' cemetery near the site show signs of healed fractures and evidence of medical treatment, including amputations that the patient survived long enough to recover from. A level of organized care archaeologists did not expect to find attached to a labor force this large. If the builders were organized, fed, and housed this well, why does the question of exactly how they achieved this level of precision remains so unresolved. Mainstream Egyptologists generally agree on the broad outline. Ramps, possibly straight or spiraling around the structure as it rose. Wooden sledges to move blocks across surfaces deliberately wetted to reduce friction. A technique actually depicted in surviving Egyptian tomb paintings, showing teams of workers pouring water just ahead of a sledge's path. Copper tools for cutting limestone, and an enormous, well-coordinated labor force capable of moving an estimated 2.3 million blocks into position. What remains genuinely unresolved, even among specialists who fully accept this framework, is the precise engineering detail of how ramps of the necessary length and stability were built, used, and then dismantled without leaving conclusive archaeological traces. A construction method we mostly understand in outline, and still cannot fully reconstruct in detail, even with every modern tool archaeology has available. That gap between "we know roughly how" and "we cannot fully replicate it" is where this story stops being a settled engineering question and starts becoming something stranger. It is also worth pausing on what the structure originally looked like, since the pyramid most visitors photograph today is not the pyramid Khufu's subjects would have seen. The Great Pyramid was once entirely encased in polished white limestone, cut and fitted with such precision that ancient accounts describe the surface as appearing almost seamless from a distance, brilliant enough under the desert sun to be visible from a considerable distance away. Most of that casing was stripped away centuries later, repurposed to build mosques and fortifications in nearby Cairo, leaving the rougher core structure exposed and visible today. That missing surface makes the precision problem even harder to picture today. So just how difficult would matching it actually be using modern tools? Consider the precision problem on its own terms for a moment. Civil engineers today, working with laser levels, GPS, and powered machinery, still consider achieving uniform leveling across a footprint the size of the Great Pyramid's base a genuinely difficult task. The ancient builders achieved it across more than 5 hectares using, as far as the archaeological evidence indicates, water channels, sighting tools, and an extraordinarily disciplined survey methodology, with no instrument more advanced than what their own Bronze Age technology could produce. The cardinal alignment presents its own separate puzzle. Petrie himself proposed that Egyptian surveyors likely tracked a star near the celestial pole using a plumb line dropped from a considerable height, taking sightings before and after the star's nightly transit to triangulate true north without any magnetic compass at all, since compasses would not exist anywhere in the world for another 2,500 years. Later, researchers have proposed refinements to this method, but the basic challenge remains the same. Achieving an alignment this precise required not a single clever trick, but a sustained, repeatable, institutionally transmitted observational technique. How does a civilization with no iron tools and no magnetic compass out-level and out-orient structures that modern construction crews still find genuinely difficult to match? Mainstream Egyptologists do not treat this as evidence of unknown technology. They treat it as evidence of an extraordinarily sophisticated, highly disciplined surveying tradition, refined over centuries of earlier, smaller pyramid construction at sites like Meidum and Dashur, a tradition of accumulated trial, error, and institutional knowledge. rather than a single unexplained leap. Khufu's pyramid, in this reading, represents the culmination of generations of architectural refinement, not an isolated miracle. Notably, the two pyramids built immediately afterward at Giza, for Khufu's son and grandson, show measurably less precise orientation, suggesting the exceptional accuracy achieved here may have depended on a specific surveying team or method that was not perfectly maintained even one generation later. That is a satisfying explanation for the precision. So why does it feel less satisfying the moment you turn to the pyramid's underlying mathematics? It is considerably less satisfying as a complete explanation for the next layer of the mystery: the pyramid's apparent relationship with one of mathematics' most famous constants. Divide the perimeter of the Great Pyramid's base by twice its height, and the result lands remarkably close to pi, accurate to within a fraction of 1%, depending on which historical measurements you use. To some researchers, this looks like unmistakable evidence of advanced mathematical knowledge, deliberately encoded into the structure's very proportions. Mainstream historians of mathematics offer a more grounded explanation, and it has nothing to do with the ancient Egyptians secretly knowing pi as we understand it today. Egyptian builders measured pyramid slopes using a unit called the seked, a ratio of horizontal palms to vertical cubits, with 7 palms equaling 1 cubit, and each palm further divided into 4 digits. The Great Pyramid's sect happens to be 5.5 palms, and when that particular whole number ratio gets converted into a slope angle, it produces a structure whose perimeter to height ratio approximates pi almost by mathematical accident, simply because of how the Egyptian unit fraction system happened to be built. The same seked appears independently on at least one other pyramid from this same general era, suggesting 5.5 palms was simply a popular, practical slope choice among Old Kingdom builders, not a uniquely chosen ratio reserved for Khufu's monument alone. A relationship that looks deliberately encoded turns out, according to most historians of mathematics, to be a side effect of an entirely different, much more practical measuring system. The same seked-driven slope produces a second, equally famous numerical echo. That identical angle, converted into a ratio between the pyramid's slant height and half its base length, lands remarkably close to phi, the golden ratio prized in art and architecture for its supposedly perfect visual proportions. Some researchers treat this as proof the Egyptians deliberately encoded sacred geometry into the structure. Mainstream historians of mathematics point out that Flinders Petrie's own original 1883 survey, the most detailed and careful measurement of the pyramid ever conducted up to that point, never once mentions phi at all. A curious silence for a relationship later writers would treat as central to the pyramid's design. Two famous irrational constants, pi and phi, both emerging from the exact same practical seked ratio, both apparently invisible to the era's most meticulous surveyor. Does that strengthen the coincidence explanation, or does it simply mean Petrie wasn't looking for the right pattern? Does that fully settle the question, though? Not entirely. Even researchers who accept the seked explanation acknowledge that the ancient Egyptians, independently, via the Rind mathematical papyrus, dated to roughly 1650 BCE, had already developed a working approximation of pi accurate to within 2% of the true value, derived from a formula for calculating the area of a circle, copied by a scribe from an even older document that has since been lost. This meant a real, demonstrated Egyptian interest in circular geometry existed in the same broad era, even if it likely wasn't the specific mechanism behind the pyramid's proportions. A genuine mathematical near-miss, with a plausible mainstream explanation, sitting right next to genuine evidence that Egyptian mathematicians really were thinking seriously about circles and ratios during this exact period of history. Coincidence layered on top of real capability, which is precisely the kind of pattern that keeps this mystery from fully closing in either direction, no matter how many times historians of mathematics walk through the sect arithmetic from the beginning. The numbers only get stranger from here because the Great Pyramid was not simply leveled and proportioned. It was pointed at the sky with an intention that still generates serious academic argument. Two narrow shafts extend from the king's chamber deep inside the pyramid, climbing at fixed angles toward the exterior surface. In the 1960s, researchers Alexander Badawi and Virginia Trimble proposed that these shafts were deliberately aligned toward specific stars. One toward the circumpolar region near the pole, associated in Egyptian religious texts with what were called the imperishable stars, and the other toward the belt of the constellation Orion, a region of the sky the Egyptians associated directly with the god Osiris. This is not a fringe claim. It draws directly on the pyramid texts themselves, the oldest known Egyptian religious writings, which explicitly describe the king's soul ascending to join the imperishable stars in the company of Osiris. According to this interpretation, the shafts were never meant for ventilation at all. They were a religious mechanism, built into solid stone, intended to direct the dead king's spirit toward a specific, named astronomical destination. A funerary chamber, deliberately engineered with sightlines to specific stars, named directly in the culture's own sacred religious texts. If true, this single architectural detail unites Egyptian astronomy, religion, and engineering into one coherent statement of purpose. For decades, that purpose remained theoretical because nobody could actually examine where the shafts led. The narrow Queen's chamber shafts in particular had never been fully explored, since they appeared to be sealed and were far too small for any person to enter. In 1993, engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink built a small robotic crawler equipped with a camera and sent it up the southern shaft to finally answer the question. After climbing more than 60 meters through solid limestone and granite, the robot's camera revealed something nobody expected: a small stone door complete with 2 copper handles blocking the passage completely. Later, exploration in 2002 drilled through that door only to find a second, smaller barrier just behind it, sealed just as deliberately as the first. A door, deliberately built into a shaft, most Egyptologists previously assumed was simple ventilation. Why build a sealed door at the end of a passage meant only for air? This is also exactly where the investigation has to draw a hard line, because one further claim about these same shafts has traveled much further into popular culture than the evidence actually supports. In 1994, researcher Robert Bauval proposed something considerably bolder: that the layout of all 3 Giza pyramids on the ground deliberately mirrors the precise arrangement of the 3 stars in Orion's belt. and that this correlation only worked perfectly for a date around 10,500 BCE, thousands of years before mainstream archaeology dates any of the pyramid's actual construction. A claim dramatic enough to anchor an entire best-selling book and a television documentary. Did it hold up under scrutiny? Mainstream Egyptologists have rejected this specific theory, sometimes in unusually blunt terms, pointing out that Bauval's own diagrams reverse the orientation of the stars relative to the ground, that the brightness differences between the three stars do not actually match the differing sizes of the three pyramids as closely as claimed, and that no Egyptian text, anywhere, describes a 10,500 BCE or construction date, or anything resembling it. So we have two astronomical claims about the exact same set of shafts and structures. One, the star shaft alignment theory, grounded directly in surviving Egyptian religious texts and broadly taken seriously by specialists, even where details remain debated. The other, the Orion correlation date, explicitly rejected by the same specialists as unsupported by either the astronomy or the archaeology. Both get presented in popular media with nearly identical confidence. Only one of them actually has the texts to back it up, which raises the deeper question underneath all of this. If the Egyptians really were encoding astronomical and religious meaning into solid stone with this level of intention, what exactly were they so determined the dead king's soul should find once it left his body behind? To answer that, we have to leave the architecture entirely and go directly to the god the southern shaft was apparently built to reach, Osiris. According to Egyptian tradition, Osiris was a wise and benevolent king of Egypt, credited with bringing agriculture and law to his people, murdered by his jealous brother Seth, who dismembered his body and scattered the pieces across the land. Osiris's wife, the goddess Isis, gathered the fragments, reassembled them with the help of the embalming god Anubis, and through her magic restored him to life, not as a living king again, but transformed, ascending to become ruler of the underworld and judge of the dead. A murdered king, ritually reassembled, resurrected not into his old life, but into an entirely new role overseeing the deaths of everyone who would follow him. Every aspect of that story, deliberately, became the template Egyptians believed they themselves needed to follow in order to survive death. This is the part of Egyptian religion the pyramid's entire purpose seems to hinge on. Mummification itself was understood, according to Egyptian belief, as a ritual reenactment of Anubis embalming Osiris's body. The pyramid texts, carved into chamber walls in later pyramids, and almost certainly reflecting beliefs already present at Giza, explicitly identify the dead king with Osiris directly, declaring the king is not dead, has not perished, in language lifted nearly word for word from the god's own myth. This was not a private belief confined to royal tombs. According to Egyptian tradition, the city of Abydos held an annual public festival reenacting the entire Osiris myth, with priests carrying statues of the god in procession across the desert to a symbolic tomb, dramatizing his murder, his mourning, and finally, his resurrection, while crowds gathered to celebrate his victory over death. Generations of ordinary Egyptians, not just pharaohs, organized their understanding of mortality around this same recurring public performance. As ruler of the underworld, Osiris also presided over what Egyptian tradition described as a final judgment. The deceased's heart weighed on a scale against the feather of the goddess Maat, who personified truth and cosmic order. A heart unweighted by wrongdoing earned passage into eternal life. A heart too heavy faced complete destruction. Every aspect of mummification, ritual, and tomb construction existed, according to this belief system, to help the dead king pass that single judgment successfully. According to this tradition, the entire pyramid was never simply a tomb in the way modern people use that word. It was understood as a machine for transformation, built specifically to take a body, treat it according to precise ritual, and send the spirit that emerged toward a particular, named destination among specific stars. Following the exact path the Egyptians believed Osiris himself had once taken. A tomb is where someone is buried. According to this interpretation, the Great Pyramid was something closer to a launch site. It's important to be precise about what this framing does and does not claim. Mainstream Egyptologists do not treat Osiris as a historical individual. The overwhelming archaeological and textual consensus is that he is a religious and mythological figure, central to Egyptian belief about death and kingship, but not a literal historical king who once ruled Egypt and was murdered exactly as the myth describes. The myth's power in this reading lies precisely in its symbolic and religious function, a story Egyptians used to make sense of mortality, not in any claim to be a literal historical record. If the purpose really was this specific, this religiously coherent, and this thoroughly documented in the Egyptians' own surviving texts, why does popular fascination with the pyramid keep reaching past this explanation toward something stranger? Perhaps because one of history's most celebrated inventors did exactly that himself more than a century ago. Nikola Tesla, the engineer behind alternating current and pioneering work in wireless energy transmission, held a well-documented lifelong fascination with ancient Egypt and its monuments, frequently citing ancient civilizations in his public lectures as evidence that humanity had once possessed, and subsequently lost, forms of practical knowledge worth rediscovering. What did that fascination actually amount to in his own documented scientific work? Tesla's actual scientific legacy here is genuine and substantial. His research into resonance, electromagnetic fields, and the long-distance transmission of electricity without wires was real, rigorous, and decades ahead of his contemporaries. That research culminated in the Wardenclyffe Tower, a genuinely ambitious wireless power transmission station Tesla began building on Long Island in 1901, funded substantially by financier J.P. Morgan. The tower was never completed. Funding collapsed once Morgan realized Tesla's true ambition was free, universal wireless power rather than a more limited and more profitable wireless telegraph system. And the unfinished structure was eventually demolished and sold for scrap in 1917, leaving Tesla's most direct, real-world attempt at large-scale wireless energy transmission permanently unrealized. A genuinely brilliant, genuinely well-funded attempt at exactly the kind of large-scale energy transmission later writers would claim he saw foreshadowed in Egyptian stone, abandoned not because the underlying physics failed, but because the financial backing did. What is considerably less documented is the specific claim, repeated constantly across modern alternative media, that Tesla concluded the Great Pyramid itself was literally an ancient power plant, deliberately engineered to harness or transmit electromagnetic energy. Searches through Tesla's own surviving notebooks, patents, and formal writings find no detailed, published theory matching this specific claim. The pyramid as power plant idea appears to have been substantially elaborated by later writers, who borrowed Tesla's genuine credibility and his genuine interest in resonance and ancient civilizations, then attached it to a specific claim about the pyramid that Tesla's own surviving documented work does not actually support in the detail usually presented. A celebrated, legitimately brilliant scientist whose real and well-documented fascination with ancient knowledge got retroactively sharpened by people writing long after his death into a far more specific and far less supported claim than anything he has reliably recorded as having said himself. There is currently no scientific evidence that the Great Pyramid generated electricity, that Tesla proved any such mechanism, or that the structure's geometry produces measurable energy effects beyond ordinary architectural and acoustic properties any large stone building would exhibit. Mainstream physicists and engineers do not treat this as an open question requiring further investigation, because the basic claim has never been demonstrated under any controlled, repeatable conditions. So why does this specific theory keep returning, decade after decade, dressed up in increasingly technical-sounding language? Some alternative researchers argue that the sheer scale of the pyramid's genuine, well-documented precision is itself evidence that something beyond ordinary tomb building was intended, that a civilization capable of leveling 5 hectares of desert to within centimeters and aligning a structure to true north within a few arc minutes must have possessed knowledge modern archaeology has failed to fully credit them with. According to this interpretation, sacred geometry, the deliberate use of specific numerical ratios in religious architecture, encodes intentional knowledge about the universe that mainstream scholarship dismisses too quickly as coincidence. A serious-sounding claim, grounded in real, measurable precision. Where does it go too far? At the more extreme edge of this territory sit claims that go considerably further than the evidence supports, that the pyramid's internal chambers generate measurable electrical energy, that hidden frequencies embedded in its geometry scientifically explain otherwise unexplained phenomena, or that the Mesopotamian god, Enki, and the Egyptian god, Osiris, represent the same historical being moving between 2 separate ancient mythologies. There is currently no evidence supporting any of these specific claims. Mainstream Egyptologists, historians of religion, and physicists do not treat them as serious hypotheses, both because the 2 mythological traditions developed independently with distinct names, attributes, and historical contexts, and because no controlled measurement of the pyramid's interior has ever detected energy output beyond what any large stone structure would ordinarily produce. So where does that leave the more measured version of the alternative argument, the one that doesn't reach quite this far? This argument deserves to be taken seriously as a question, even where its more elaborate conclusions go well beyond the evidence. The precision is real. The mathematical relationships are measurable. What's contested is not whether these patterns exist, but whether they represent deliberate, sophisticated encoding of advanced scientific knowledge, or whether they emerge naturally from a sufficiently skilled, sufficiently motivated Bronze Age civilization. solving practical engineering and religious problems using the tools and mathematics actually available to them. Mainstream Egyptologists generally favor the second explanation, and the sect-based mathematics examined earlier gives that position genuine evidentiary weight. But genuine weight is not the same as a complete, fully satisfying account of everything this structure does. The gap between "we have a plausible explanation" and "we have fully closed every question" is exactly where alternative theories continue to find room to grow. So, after more than a century of survey data, papyrus translations, and increasingly precise measurement, what do scholars actually, confidently know? They know the pyramid's basic chronology, construction period, and the identity of the king it was built for, established through multiple independent lines of textual and archaeological evidence, including quarry marks bearing Khufu's name found inside the structure itself. They know the broad outline of how it was likely built, even without a complete reconstruction of every engineering detail. They know its mathematical proportions almost certainly derive from a practical Egyptian measuring system rather than secret advanced knowledge of irrational constants. And they know, with considerable confidence drawn directly from Egyptian religious texts, that the structure's purpose was bound up with the Osiris myth, intended to transform a dead king into an eternal, stellar version of himself. That much genuinely is settled, beyond any serious academic dispute. So what, after all this, still isn't? What they do not know, and may never know with full certainty, is the precise day-to-day engineering reality of moving 2.3 million blocks into position with this degree of precision, using only Bronze Age tools. They also do not know, beyond informed interpretation of religious texts, exactly how literally the builders themselves understood their own astronomical alignments, as functional religious technology, as symbolic gesture, or as something in between that modern categories don't map onto cleanly at all. And they still do not know, more than 30 years after Gantenbrink's robot first found it, what lies beyond that sealed stone door deep inside the southern shaft, or why anyone went to the trouble of blocking a passage that supposedly led nowhere. That gap between confirmed fact and genuine, irreducible uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It may be the single most honest thing this investigation can say about the pyramid at all. So we return to where this episode began. A surveyor with a theodolite, recording a level of precision that should have closed the case more than a century ago, and instead opened a question that still has not finished generating new answers. The Great Pyramid's deepest mystery may never have been a question of engineering at all. The how, however difficult, sits within reach of mainstream archaeology's existing tools and explanations, even where some specific details, like the exact mechanics of the ramps, remain stubbornly unresolved. The why is a different kind of question entirely. One Egyptian texts answer with remarkable clarity and confidence, describing a king's soul ascending to join Osiris among the imperishable stars, even as that same answer continues to feel, to many modern observers encountering it for the first time, somehow insufficient to explain a structure this enormous, this precise, and this strange. Perhaps that gap between a documented religious purpose and the sheer physical improbability of its execution is the real, permanent mystery here. Not evidence of something hidden, but evidence of exactly how far human ambition, belief, and sheer organizational will can apparently travel. Once a civilization becomes utterly convinced that getting the details right truly was a matter of life, death, and eternity. What would it take, 4,500 years later, standing at the base of that same structure, to finally feel certain we've understood not just how they built it, but what they actually believed they were building it for?